Okay, let's get started and hopefully more people will trickle in as I do my introduction and just in time for when Ben gets started. Just a quick announcement that this event is being recorded. I want to begin with the land acknowledgement. I know we are not all in Walla Walla, but many of us are, and that's where Whitman is located. We acknowledge that the land we live, teach, and learn on is part of the traditional homelands of the Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Cayuse peoples, ceded during the Walla Walla Treaty Council of 1855. We recognize the continued presence and sovereignty of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation on the reserved lands near Pendleton, Oregon, and throughout the surrounding area, and acknowledge their stewardship of this land as we work alongside them today. Okay, so I've often said that the best thing about working at Whitman is that you get to work with brilliant students, then you get to see them do brilliant things in the world, and then if you're lucky, you get to invite them back and host them at an event like this to hear their brilliance. So I'm really thrilled, proud, I'm not sure what the right affect here is, to welcome my former student, now colleague and dear friend, Dr. Benjamin Meiches, to join us to give a talk on his work on genocide and international law. Before it got really windy today, I was going to go to my office and find Ben's senior honors thesis. I didn't get to do it, but my plan had been to go find that thesis just to show that he started developing his expertise in genocide studies at Whitman College. His thesis, I believe, was on the Nuremberg trials. And I remember a really energetic senior oral exam with my colleague, Professor Zahi Zalua. Ben graduated from Whitman in 2007. I believe I told Ben that then that he was condemned to a life in academia. He tells me that he's a great baker. I believe he's now a doting father of two, but reading, writing, thinking, nerding is how I know Ben. And it is hard for me to imagine that he does anything else. Predictably, he went to grad school right after Whitman and received his doctorate in political science at Johns Hopkins University under the supervision of another dear friend of mine. He started working at the University of Washington, Tacoma right after finishing his PhD, received tenure with flying colors last year, and is now an associate professor of security studies and conflict resolution. Ben is a prolific scholar with many, many articles in top-notch journals. His book, The Politics of Annihilation, A Genealogy of Genocide, published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2019, is a superb account of the contested political process through which the concept of genocide came to acquire prominence in global politics, and what kinds of violence its form makes legible and what kinds it obscures. In today's talk, his focus will primarily be on the exclusion of mental harm from discussions of genocide in the application of international law. The title of his talk is Genocide by Brain, International Law After Neuroscience. The talk is sponsored by the Jackson Endowment in International Studies and part of the programming for the Race, Violence, and Health team. Please welcome Dr. Ben Meiches.
Thank you, and thank you to Shampa, to the Whitman Politics program, to Whitman College in general. I remember about 8 years ago, I was at the International Studies Association annual conference, and I ran into Dr. Bruce Magnuson there. And we had a nice long conversation, which he told me basically the hardest thing you can ever do is go back and give a presentation or a discussion in front of your advisors. And so I confess to a great deal of nervousness in actually giving the talk today because of all the people who have nurtured and helped me grow and think in new ways. But I'm also pleased to see such a large turnout and excited to share with you. I think the theme on race, violence, and health is essential. It strikes me as somewhat odd, both giving a talk in this format to a campus that I spent a significant portion of my life at, and because when I was a senior there, as I recall, in 2006, there was a blackface incident at Whitman College, which sponsored a series of conversations and conventions around the problem of anti-Black racism or racism and marginalization on campus. And so in some ways, I'm sure that this seems a little bit like the eternal return of the same in the context of this kind of institution in higher ed, and maybe Whitman specifically. And I guess I would make a plea as an alumnus for us to remain critical of how to address that problem in a meaningful institutional way, and also hope that in some small sense, this talk contributes to the way that people can speculate about new ways to confront institutional harm. So that said, I'm going to share my screen with you and walk through, as Champa said, my talk today is entitled Genocide by Brain. And I'm going to start by just kind of talking about genocide in general as a concept. So if you think about genocide, chances are that you're most likely to think about something like an international institution or forum where discussions about how to save people from mass violence might take place, such as the United Nations or maybe the International Criminal Court in punishment. You might think about the shameful history of the United States with respect to its inability to kind of come to terms with events of genocide, both in other places and abroad, such as here, where Christine Shelley parsed the concept of genocide into acts of genocide when Rwandan genocide was occurring in order to deflect any responsibility for the Clinton administration intervention. You might think about the people who perpetrate violence, such as Hermann Göring, and whether you think of them as radically evil or banal. There are obviously a series of presentations of genocide that hinge on monsters and evil men that carry out terrible acts. And those are all important parts of our kind of cultural or social imaginary surrounding genocide. What I want to speak about today, though, is a bit of a departure from some of those, because while there are a lot of different techniques and modalities and images associated with genocide, the actual history of genocide is, in fact, quite contested. The creation of genocide as a concept is barely 70 years old, and a rich and understudied part of that history has to do with the role of colonization and colonial racism as a constituent part of genocide, and the attempt to get forms of mental health and mental harm as a bedrock part of international law in this area, which I think have become actually more resonant in the context of contemporary neuroscience. So my talk is going to be kind of split into three sections. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of genocide, then I'll transition into the ways that conversations around genocide have changed in contemporary times. I'll talk a bit about some modern neuroscientific discovery and the way that they expose the complexity of the brain as both a biological and social object. And then I'll transition at the end to talk about how this is related to a kind of colonial politics. And in general, I'm going to make kind of three arguments in my talk. The first is that genocide occurs through techniques of mental harm, and those do not necessarily result in biological death, and yet the Genocide Convention actually explicitly includes them as acts of genocide. I'll just kind of shorthand those as genocide by brain. I'll second claim that that actually changes the way we should understand the ontology, temporality, and spatiality of mass violence. It's actually fortuitous that you had Rob Nixon here just the other night, because his argument around slow violence and the way in which violence can take delayed form or latency is really important, I think, for understanding genocide, not simply as an immediate event, but as one that takes a long toll. And third, I think that this is actually critical to kind of both underlining and supercharging whatever anti-colonial or anti-racist politics are bound up with the way we talk and think about genocide. So I'm going to try to make all three of those claims. That's obviously a lot. I'm going to be summarizing and jumping around. Dr. Biswas could tell you that I have a propensity to move fleetingly through ideas, so I'm happy to try to extrapolate as much as possible at any point in the Q&A. So here we go. If you've heard the concept of genocide before, it's at least indirectly related to the man on your screen right now, who is Raphael Lincoln. He's a Polish Jewish jurist who fled by foot in 1939 from the Nazi occupation of Poland. Prior to that, he was an international lawyer who helped deal with all manner of different kinds of legal patents and questions of state-to-state interaction in Europe, and was part of an international justice movement that was trying to figure out what international laws would look like if they were to help minoritized and marginalized people in Europe. After the Nazi invasion, he ends up on kind of a spectacular train journey across the Soviet Union, takes a boat across the Pacific, ends up in beautiful Seattle, Washington, and is ultimately hosted by Duke University and his academic colleagues. And it's in that context that Lemkin comes up with the concept of genocide. And he somewhat fortuitously is involved in discussions around the formation of the Nuremberg tribunals. And the reason he's plugged into that context is that Robert Jackson, who's the chief legal counsel for the United States, was looking for as much documentary evidence as possible of all of the negative changes the Nazis had made to European law, and Lemkin had a voluminous memory of all of these different domestic legal statutes. And so he's brought in kind of as an expert on that point, and he takes that opportunity to seize and advocate for this new concept that he's created, which appears in publication for the first time in 1943 in a book that he writes called Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. And this, what you're looking at now, is the very first attempt that anyone in print basically has to publish the notion of genocide. Lots of commentators now in contemporary genocide studies seize on this as a really important document. They say, well, genocide says in the first couple lines, we mean the destruction of a nation or ethnic group. And while that's an important part of what Lemkin is talking about, he's also inheriting a Eastern European sociological tradition, which would have understood the notion of a nation in a much more porous or flexible way than the way that we might hear it. Douglas Irvin Erickson actually makes the claim that this is pretty much analogous to Benedict Anderson's idea of an imagined community. So there are many different modes or forms of nationality in his mind. And another key thing is that Lemkin thought about genocide as a multifaceted or multi-technique process. It's not simply mass killing. So you'll note kind of about 2/3 of the way through the quote, he says the objectives of the plan include attacks on political social institutions, culture, feelings, religion, economics, dignity, health, and even the lives. So there's a lot going on in his conception of genocide. Well, Lemkin is actually treated as something of a nuisance during Nuremberg because he keeps on pushing for this agenda. But almost accidentally, several of the prosecutors in the Nuremberg tribunal start using the language of genocide, and people start saying, well, this is kind of an appropriate vocabulary, even though they only have really a sense of what it means rather than a strict definition to describe this kind of crime. In 1946, the UN passes a resolution calling for the creation of a genocide convention. And remember, this is only 3 or 4 years after this term has first appeared in print in any form. There is a great deal of uncertainty about how to implement or to come up with this treaty. And so they ask the UN Secretariat to do it. And actually, the Secretariat passes the work to Lemkin and a number of other experts. And they come up with this, which is called the Secretariat Draft of the UN Convention. And it is a multifaceted document. It says genocide can happen to almost any human group. It says that any act that results in this kind of destruction rather than an intent to destroy could be considered an act of genocide. It has everything from control over marriage to assassination to disparate forms of feeding and nutrition as potential acts of genocide. It's very, very kind of catch-all in its attempts to characterize all forms of contemporary violence as its authors kind of understood them at that point in time. Well, most of the states in the General Assembly at that point in time immediately reject the idea that this would work. It's too broad in their minds, and it potentially imperils the way in which the extant colonial powers and imperial powers manage their internal affairs and their colonies, right? There's a lot of these elements that the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France would be guilty of, and they would reject it on that ground. One of the major problems with emerging international law is that it requires the compliance of the states that it has to regulate. And so there's a fear that this would kill any kind of treaty surrounding the issue, and yet all of the states have committed to making it. So instead, they form what's called the Ad Hoc Committee, which is a group of about 10 or 12 states that try to refine the concept of genocide. And in doing so, they narrow it down fairly substantially. They eliminate many of the articles that Lemkin thought were most important. And the most kind of critical is that they actually substantially constrict what's called cultural genocide. And in doing so, they were trying to make what many scholars have focused on as kind of grand compromise between the great powers so that they would not be critical of one another's colonial policies. And that in many ways, people who are very nefarious, such as Joseph Stalin, had a heavy hand in writing and implementing the way in which these treaty obligations might look out, or what they might look like. And as a consequence of that, there was very slim room for kind of negotiations. The final text that comes out of the General Assembly that then gets ratified and signed on to is this. So this is the text of the Genocide Convention. Article 2 is the really kind of pertinent one. And there are some major changes that are noteworthy in this document. The first is that, and this is one many people have called out, only 4 types of groups are actually protected by genocide under international law, those being national, ethnic, racial, and religious groups. And this version of nationality is very different from Lemkin's. It was defined by static identity categories. There's even arguments that these are based in the biology of groups. Another major change is that intent becomes really important. So there's what's called an international law specific intent standard. That means when you commit an act of genocide, what you're really trying to do, the knowledge of your consequences, is that it will destroy a group, and that is the reason why you have activated that knowledge, which is a much higher threshold. And another thing, as you've noted probably already, is that the acts of genocide are very constricted. What we call or think of as cultural genocide has basically been eliminated. And most of our kind of discussion is centered on instead killing or very visible forms of harm, very traditional forms of harm. And I don't want to minimize the importance of those, but many genocide studies commentators have criticized this document as far too limited with respect to the groups it describes, with respect to the acts it describes, and I agree with those criticisms. However, there's also some, if you will, secret or hidden in this text, I think, anti-colonial politics, and it hinges on this clause B, causing serious bodily or mental harm. Because a plain text reading from our historical vantage point of that element of the treaty makes us think about mental health. And that is what it's talking about. But both the reasons why that's included in this treaty and the reasons why it's considered important are deeply involved in an interesting intersection of what I would say is brain health and colonial politics. So the rationale for having this actually appeared in the ad hoc committee negotiations. And it's the representative from China, whose name was T-Sun Lee, who brought it up. And he made the contention that under Japanese occupation during the Second World War, that the Japanese states had actually carried out acts of genocide against the people of China. And in specific, he's referencing the deployment of narcotics and the use of opiates as a form of social and political control. And this is just a single document out of what's called the Travaux Préparatoires, which is the series of records we have around the negotiations at the UN about this. But he was adamant that this act, the use of narcotics, impacted the mental faculties of the citizens of China, and as a result, undermined their labor capacities, disrupted their social rituals, actually had negative effects, obviously, on their health, undermined their laboring capacities, and was an attack or an affront against any form of social cohesion, and therefore was an act of genocide. Because, and this is very critical, the actual subject, the victim, if you will, of genocide is not an individual person per se. It's actually the collectivity or the social identity, or what I term form of life itself. And so he was very clear that the use of these tools were nefarious in that particular way. And what's interesting is that he actually got support from a number of different players in the ad hoc committee, including the United States. So this is actually a separate document that I've highlighted a bit too much, perhaps, that is about the opiate production facilities at Mukden and the distribution of opiates as part of Japanese occupation. And the claim is actually relatively well accepted that this could be a tangible form of mass violence, right? Forced narcotic consumption would obviously be a form, but Raphael Lincoln and other people around it had also talked about the distribution of alcohol and other mind-altering substances as potentially a kind or a mode of violence, right? So there were already, if you will, precursors that were open to this claim. However, if you read T-Sun Lee carefully enough, he is also very interested in pointing out that this is a policy of occupation and imperialism, although he doesn't reference explicitly colonialism or talk about, obviously, China's much longer history and interaction with European colonial and imperial states. It's in the background of the negotiations and in the textual encounters where you can see them talking to one another. It's obvious that he is speaking to Japan, but also invoking and thinking about a much longer litany in history. And so this is a way, in a certain way, of politicizing the problem of extant colonial politics, at least in my mind. And a number of other commentators, such as Dirk Moses and Douglas Irvin Erickson, who read this, also can find a lot of support for there being an anti-colonial politics embedded in this document, albeit somewhat secretly. Again, if we go back to the text of it, you wouldn't know just because of the existence of the term mental harm that that's a part of the politics that's ongoing here. Right. What happens, unfortunately, is that following the ratification or following the UN's agreement on the Genocide Convention, there's a great reluctance to make this agenda meaningful. And the traditional way in which this has been understood, if you read like Samantha Power, for instance, is a problem of state sovereignty and the idea that states like to be independent and unaffected by one another. Right? It's a very bedrock claim in the study of international law. that's actually a bit of a misnomer. In the United States context, and the US doesn't actually ratify the Genocide Convention until 87, 88, nearly 40 years after it's already been agreed upon by the United Nations. That claim is more about specific forms of racist control and fears about political protest from Black and Indigenous Americans than it is about sovereignty per se. Now, people described this Genocide Convention as a giant anti-lynching bill, as the end of segregation. And well, I don't have time to go into this in depth. The Civil Rights Congress, which was a Black communist movement in the 1940s and 50s, actually filed a petition called We Charge Genocide, which indicted the United States for its policies of segregation and used the language of the Genocide Convention to very precisely show the way in which the US was guilty of the very charges that it had potentially signed on to. And so there's a big movement away from implementing this convention in order to be able to undermine those kinds of political protests. And in the US context, there's an interesting counterfactual history we might talk about, where civil rights becomes our language for thinking about anti-racism in the 50s and 60s, because genocide was essentially extinguished since it would be too robust. And yet, as Carol Anderson, who's a historian, says, the Justice Department, when they reviewed these memos, found them very meticulous. Needless to say, the end point is that in large part, there is a death or an absence of discourse and discussion around genocide immediately following this period, and that stays around for quite a long time. This is actually Google Ngram data, which is the frequency with which references are to any given language. And as you see, it's not really until the mid-1980s, late 1970s that there's a spike in the use of the term genocide in publications. And then that actually increases through the 2000s all the way up into our present day. And one of the major things that kind of drives that is a parallel rise in interest in human rights. Right. And so in the late 1970s, there are a number of different historical movements that lead to a call for a new kind of international justice. In my opinion, Samuel Moyne's The Last Utopia offers one of the kind of best accounts of this period, where many of the grand visions of international justice in the future, whether that's liberal democracy or communism, had kind of collapsed. And in that period, there's sort of a minimal interest in some standard for justice that vaults the human rights agenda into everyone's kind of popular focus. And there are a number of other things that are ongoing. I can't kind of go into all their detail. But one thing that happens in that moment is that genocide is transformed from its own distinctive multifaceted crime into kind of the ultimate human rights violation. And while there's nowhere in the body of international law that kind of creates this hierarchy, there's sort of one implied where human rights are one form of violation, crime against humanity is another, and genocide is kind of the worst thing that you can do. What's strange about that, and in effect actually a historical erasure, is that the people who were fighting to include genocide in the agenda and have a genocide convention were in many ways opposed to human rights and the idea of crimes against humanity. Human rights are notoriously bound up with the individual and their embodiment, right? It's your rights that have been violated, whereas genocide, the point of the crime is to affect a group or a form of identity itself. And so there's an entirely different subject at stake there. But in the 1970s, after 30 or 40 years of not employing this vocabulary, all of a sudden genocide becomes just kind of the ultimate human rights violation. And that's in many ways the way in which we think about it. That kind of drift is reflective of what Michel Foucault might call a different episteme, meaning a different way of knowing or understanding and interpreting texts, right? So we had one kind of present in the 1940s and a new one that's emerged somewhat subsequent to that. The other thing that happens in this period is that there is a new kind of fascination and obsession with spectacular forms of violence in the form of Rwanda and the violence in the former Yugoslavia and Bosnia. And the first international courts actually emerged to try to reinterpret the Genocide Convention, right? So the ICTR and the ICTY. And in this context, you have what is really the first substantive legal commentary on the meaning of the Genocide Convention since it's been passed 50 years ago. And these commentaries tend to be somewhat ahistorical. They are not reading all of the depth that's involved in the discussion surrounding why different articles in the Genocide Convention are there. And the way in which they envision the politics of genocide is very much obsessed with punishment for select groups of individuals, right? As opposed to broadly how in social science would we understand the commission of a certain kind of mass violence. So this is an example of what ends up happening to mental harm in this context. It is redefined substantively to be about things like torture, rape, and other what's called non-physical violence that causes disfigurement or serious injury. So what the court tried to do is to think about mental harm not merely as intimidation or causing fear, but rather to think about it as some kind of gratuitous physical violence, right? And there is no mention of the discussion surrounding narcotics in this text, and there's no discussion of any kind of psychological injury or the laboring capacities of a group. And in some ways, this is a really important move. The court was trying to consider gender-animated forms of violence, which are obviously a significant part of contemporary warfare and mass violence and need to be acknowledged, but it also lost the opportunity to think a little bit more robustly. And I want to say that while there's been this kind of drift to contemporary legal interpretations of genocide away from maybe what they were originally kind of developed, and it turns out I'm an originalist too in some ways, there's a parallel thing that happens, which is that the people in the 1940s that are thinking about mental harm, so Lemkin and T-Sun Lee, are obviously writing before we have any of the new discoveries from neuroscience, right, which is itself its own episteme that's kind of developed to think about the brain, its meaning, its significance, what it does in a significant way. The discipline of neuroscience doesn't exist in the 1940s and 50s. The MRI, which is one of the principal instruments that we use to actually study the brain and its reactions, isn't invented yet and certainly not deployed in widespread ways. And many of the terms that we would now potentially really think about as integral or important to kind of brain health and well-being are not part of the vocabulary. So like traumatic brain injury, for instance, or post-traumatic stress disorder. And one of the features of discourse on genocide in both academic study and legal study is that much of the conversation has kind of given up on the question of how to deal with modern biological sciences and discoveries, even if they add tremendous complexity into our accounts of the way that different forms of violence affect us. And so I think, and this is part of the argument, that if you include some of the cues from modern neuroscience and neurological medicine, that you end up with a much richer and in some ways more problematic account of violence. And I'm going to kind of talk through this. In many ways, this is inspired by philosopher Ketzer Melibu's question, what should we do with our brain? Which is a way of trying to poke the humanities and social sciences to address or think about the fact that materially you are both sort of a self and a brain, and you're going to have to figure out how to wrestle with those things. And I actually think that's kind of integral in the text of the Genocide Convention. So I'm going to just briefly describe kind of three categories of violence, and I'm crudely summarizing here different kinds of neuroscience. I'm obviously not a neuroscientist in any way, so I'm sort of referencing other bodies of literature that exist in talking about three different kind of modalities or forms of brain injury or brain violence that we might understand as involved in kinds of genocide. So for instance, we're kind of we are probably familiar with TBI or chronic traumatic encephalopathy because of football in the context of the United States. We discovered that if you even have a mild trauma to your head, that can cause changes over the blood-brain barrier, that those will present in later in life potentially with things like dementia and cognitive decline. Sometimes literature here discusses like an invisible threshold of harm, meaning we don't know how hard an injury has to be to your body or to what part exactly in order to precipitate a really serious set of consequences. And so while there's an element of this that is, we might call subjective, right? In this sense, I mean, varying from person to person, that brain injury is quite serious and that it can have catastrophic effects on a person's sense of self and many of their capacities. There's a danger a little bit in some of this of adopting a normative image of the brain or a normative image of what it means to have brain health. But I think that there are important lessons here about what can happen to a person as well. Another kind of key observation is that, well, you might have heard of neuroplasticity before, and I'm going to talk about that some more in just a second. There are limits to what's called regenerative neuroplasticity. So your brain can relearn to do some things, but at a certain stage, if you get damaged as a result of an injury, there may be only a one-way or unilateral process of kind of decline as a consequence of that. We also know about what I'm going to call systemic forms of violence in relationship to the brain. And here, I'm not thinking so much about direct physical acts of violence, but other things that are influencing the brain as it goes through its development. Obviously, there are infectious diseases such as meningitis and encephalitis that have potentially significant impact on the development of the brain, changing everything from learning patterns we know and sensory adaptations to hearing and other kinds of functions. And then there are all kinds of evidence coming out that if you end up in situations of chronic deprivation with respect to food and nutrition, environmental, and some forms of social support in adults, you can alter their brain in significant ways. You might have heard, for instance, in the context of recommendations surrounding Alzheimer's, that one of the things they encourage people to do is to eat well, but also to be continually active in their cognitive faculties as a way to try to recuperate some of that chronic deprivation. And in children, any temporary deficit that's acute enough in those areas can have significant effects, especially in the developmental phases between 0 to 6. These are all things that are relatively well established. There are also environmental exposures, whether that's in a neonatal exposure or a postnatal exposure to environment or specific chemicals that can also cause significant effects on the brain. Lastly, we might talk about what I call the symbolic violence against the brain, or that affects brains. And here I'm thinking of the social, because the brain is a weird organ in that it is both imminently material, but also at the same time totally social, and one that requires, at least in the context of human brain development and kind of ongoing maintenance, a socialization process. So linguist K. David Harrison, for instance, maintains that if you strip somebody out of a linguistic context, that they'll actually lose a sense of meaning, because their brain has to be operative and using complex linguistic symbols over time in order for them to be able to understand and relate to a version of the world. That indirect forms of exposure to trauma can have really precipitative and negative effects in terms of what people feel in their behavioral environments and how they interact with them. And then there are all kinds of different forms of disruption to place, self, family, that we also know have pretty immediate ramifications on the brain. All right. And these studies are almost all done in the context of looking at an individual from the purpose of how would we be able to document and treat their health, right? So they're studies of an individual person, and yet these are relatively consistent discoveries, even if there are variations amongst the human beings that are under question, right? What's interesting to me a little bit is if you were to try to synthesize some of this, one of the major problems proposed by the brain, and here I'm again cueing into Catherine Malibu's work, is the plasticity of the brain. And plasticity in her mind is that the brain is both formative in the sense that it can kind of give instructions and give form to the way you relate and experience things, but it is also formed by the events that transpire to it. And so you're in this weird predicament where brains can change in certain ways, and you as a self will change along with those brains, but they can also be changed, and as a consequence, you can be changed. And there's another kind of trick here, which is that our version of conscious self, as we understand and relate to it, is a result of work that our brain is doing in intersection with its environment, kind of its brainy ecology. And yet we're also not that self. We're actually in some ways very dependent on our brain, hence the problem of, for instance, brain death. She actually comes up with this category to try to explain how certain kinds of brain injury can be particularly problematic, what she terms destructive plasticity. And in a case of destructive plasticity, she uses the example, for instance, of a lesion on somebody's brain. What ends up happening is what we would usually think about: self-transformation, overcoming certain kinds of boundaries, unsettling the self in important ways, actually only occurs through the erosion or erasure of a self. And so your body may be very much biologically alive, and you might be living and identified as the same person, and yet whatever the subjectivity is associated with that body, however you kind of present and identify, can undergo permanent and sort of irreducible elimination. Right? And she uses this to help think through the problems of what she terms an annihilating metamorphosis that can happen in a person, and that plasticity in the context of the brain confronts us with. Usually and often in social theory, we celebrate transformation, we celebrate self-overcoming and kind of transitions. And yet it's a problem where there are obvious potentials for the self to kind of be destroyed as a consequence of harm to the brain. So here we're going to put these two things together a little bit. We've got a history of mental harm as part of genocide law on the one hand, and we have this concept of destructive plasticity. One of the things that's happened as a result of the Genocide Convention is the marginalization of what we might call acts of cultural genocide. For instance, things like displacement, destruction of language, cultural rituals, undermining basic social nutritive conditions, environmental conditions for people, or the imposition of other, what Raphael Lincoln called patterns of life for those same populations. And in many ways, those kinds of violence are never seen. They don't have the same kind of spectacular dimensions to them that we associate with acts of genocide, and so they're never sort of interpreted in that way. And there's some very tangible political struggles that are hinge on that right now. So for instance, on your screen on the right, we've got the Truth and Reconciliation report in Canada, which is about the use of residential school systems, which certainly involved extensive abuse of First Nations in Canada and individuals there, but also probably confronts many of these kinds of long-term neurological effects, which the Genocide Convention also includes. Unfortunately, in the Canadian context, for instance, all of this documentation proves cultural genocide occurred, but that cultural genocide is not a part of Canadian law or international law, and so it is only a question of domestically how they're going to adjudicate and kind of deal with questions of reparation as opposed to a violation of international law. Instead, I would actually propose that that Article B of the Genocide Convention is very much thinking about exactly these kinds of acts. That is, in essence, genocide is a form of destructive plasticity at scale where the self that's under destruction and being attacked is not just an individual person or an individual person's sense of self, but that sense of self as it relates to a broader sociality or form of life. Because one of the things that's been part of genocide politics from the beginning, or the idea of genocide rather, is that you are both simultaneously an individual and an individual in some kind of collectivity. And if you can destroy that element of your individuality associated with the collectivity, then you can destroy the collectivity even if you leave people biologically alive. And so what we're confronted with effectively is the possibility of genocide without death. That genocide is an intent to destroy a form of life, and that we're actually updating and enhancing our techniques to be able to do so. And this is what Claudia Card, following Orlando Patterson, calls social death, right? That we can kill a symbolic form of life or a social form of life without actually affecting the biological body in the same way. And that because there's such a disposition in genocide studies to focus on acts of mass killing, and that's where media attention and spectacular violence kind of takes us, we've ignored this possibility, which is in many ways much more problematic for the post-colonial predicament that we live in which the temporality of mental harm that's kind of being outlined by people from Tees and Lee, and I think increasingly neuroscience in certain ways supports, creates periods of extensive violence that are not just long-term, but also constitutive, meaning that they're having the kinds of intergenerational effects where it's not possible in a way to reproduce identities as there used to be. And as a result, what we might think about as the kind of map of mass violence is kind of problematic. This is, for instance, Genocide Watch, which is one of the major NGOs that protests acts of genocide, map of where active genocides are occurring. And if you note, this map concentrates primarily on the global south. Most of the states in question are in Africa or the Middle East. And it's urging Western states to take a more active role in controlling the violent politics there. Well, that's an important thing to do. It also weirdly reproduces extant colonial maps, right? And so there's a neo-colonial dimension potentially that needs to be explored in some humanitarian politics. Well, the settled dimensions of many of these states, whether that's the US, or Canada or Australia, involves forms of mental harm and the kinds of genocide by brain that are in many ways longstanding. In other words, when we're talking about the predicament of genocide, we shouldn't just be focusing on those event-based elements. We need to be focusing on genocide as present, very much in the lived experience of people in the everyday. That genocide is both a racist policy, but also a race-making policy in a certain way, and it helps to inform the terms that we're dealing with, even to this day, that are part of polite and sometimes in this country, obviously very impolite political conversation. And this is also why I think this lends itself to a certain kind of anti-colonial politics, because if we understand genocide not only in the immediate loss of life that might be happening in some place far away, but as part of our immediate experience, it gives us other avenues to be able to work on it in a serious way. I would also say that this is a part of a much longer standing colonial critique of mass violence. And I'm just going to end on this note here because I don't want to go too long. I want to entertain different kinds of questions. But Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, right at the conclusion, calls for a new model of man, right, in his term, and he uses the gender universal there, but he very, very self-consciously says that the third world must start over a new history of man, which takes account not only of the occasional prodigious theses maintained by Europe, but also its crimes, the most heinous of which have been committed at the very heart of man, the pathological dismembering of his functions, the erosion of his unity, and in the context of the community, the fracture, the stratification, and the bloody tensions fed by class, and finally, on the immense scale of humanity, the racial hatred, slavery, exploitation, and above all, the bloodless genocide whereby 1.5 billion men have been written off. And I think that he has, in 1961, right before his death, captured what the politics of genocide has in many ways had as its kind of inner kernel, or at least an important part of it that needs to be brought back into the political forefront, because it's really the challenge that in many ways is at our forefront in our everyday lives as people living in post-colonial and settled colonial states. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ben. That was wonderful. So there are a few questions in the Q&A box. So I was going to suggest that we also, in addition to people putting in questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box, I believe if you put it in the chat box, everybody can see them. But if you put it in the Q&A box, only Ben and I can see them. But I'm also going to suggest that if you have a question that you want to ask, I'm going to try to unmute you. I think I can do this. We haven't tried this before. It has frustrated me before when I have been at talks and I've wanted to ask a complicated question that it has taken me forever to type it out and I've lost the thread by then. So I think it might be helpful for people to just talk their questions aloud if I can make it possible for them to do so. So I'm going to say, type in your questions if you would like to, but if you just want to speak your question out aloud, indicate that you want to ask a question, and I'm going to try to unmute you and ask you to say your question out loud. Okay, so let's start with the questions that are already in the question and answer box. I think, Ben, you can read them too. So there are 3 questions by the same person. The first is, to what extent do you think genocidal mental harm can be passed on to subsequent generations, like Black Americans with ancestors who were enslaved, or the children, grandchildren of Holocaust survivors? The second question is, have any researchers attempted to develop a way to measure quantitatively or qualitatively the effects of mental harm on a self, something that perhaps would impact reparations? And I'll read the third one, perhaps you want to take them together. Does Mr. Meiches have any suggested alternative resources, perhaps for students in middle school or high school, to the Genocide Watch Map? It's a resource that's used by many teachers.
Okay, those are great questions. And I appreciate that the theme here for Whitman is on race, violence, and health, because I know that a couple of weeks ago you had a speaker that was coming in to deal with the problem of epigenetics, right, and the transfer of trauma. And I didn't get an opportunity to actually see that talk. So I'm not obviously a scientist and don't know about how an epigenetic process would occur, but certainly there's good documentation in the psychological literature and live debates about the potential for intergenerational trauma having both biological and psychological effects. I think that it's much easier to make the case in a certain sense that though there are clear ramifications to the way in which violence gets memorialized, and in Malibu's sense, it literally becomes, in a way, an element of self, right? Where there's another indigenous scholar named Robbie Shilliam who uses the term ethnogenesis to describe the way in which how one identifies can be, sort of irreducibly marked by forms of violence. And I think that that's very clear. Whether or not that would be pertinent to debates about reparation depend a little bit on what you think of a politics of reparation as a strategy for addressing these kinds of situations. I sometimes tease my students that reparations in the context of the United States to me looks like, most of the continental United States being returned, and then we can have a conversation about what justice means. And that's obviously out of most people's sort of field of what's reasonable. And so I'm not sure exactly how to address that. I'm not aware of people developing a qualitative or quantitative measure on the effects of the self that translates quite in the way that this work does. One of the problems is that most of those types of research are focused on the self like an individual and not the self in the form of the community, because they take the individual and their biological capacity as their unit, right? Because they're trying to keep a person alive as opposed to a community. And there's some other issues there, like an identity is obviously not irreducible to a biology. And so if you accept that, then the question of how you destroy it or how you affect it or how you document it is much, much harder. And there's a kind of fuzzy line there to some extent. And there are a number of different resources people have kind of addressed to help think about a different, less colonially inflected politics of genocide that I can share with you if you want.
Great. I think I'd seen Stephanie raise her hand before. I'm not sure if she wanted to ask a question or just say hi. Stephanie, if you want to ask a question, can you indicate that? But I'm going to read the question that's here from Professor Jack Jackson, which is a question that I also had. any danger in making genocide too capacious of a concept? Any value in naming some of the harms, injustices you've mapped without recourse to the concept of genocide?
Yeah, I think there is serious danger there. Maybe the most foremost danger is that it reifies certain concepts of identity and ends up, in my version of it, potentially installing a normative image of the brain and brain health and who people were, in a way that, for instance, might pose problems in how we deal with diaspora, how we deal with disparation and change. There are any number of instances where movements seize the vocabulary of genocide in order to police societies, and sometimes very violently so. In many ways, you could understand the history of the vocabulary of genocide as kind of two movements, one towards increasing and expanding the horizon of equity with respect to who we acknowledge and what kinds of pain and harm, and on the other hand, trying to close that off and say there are only certain kind of specialized cases of harm. And so I'm wary of that danger. I'm less concerned in the context of this particular argument, partly because there is so much weariness to think about cultural genocide as a meaningful category amongst both the international legal community and even amongst academic scholars to some extent, depending on who you talk to. And I think that opens up a lot of really, really messy questions about how we think about the constitution of society, what international law is actually trying to obligate us to do. And most of those will probably not result in mass political action, is my guess. But that's why I think they're important to stage the question, because they are, I think, fundamentally about like what kinds of identity and forms of life get promoted and reproduced and which get destroyed. So I think there's a danger there. I don't view this particular version of the argument as that. I think it's more a form of critique. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to click on a button that says allow to talk for Stephanie. Okay, there you go.
Okay, am I here?
Yes, you are.
Hi, Stephanie.
Beaming in from Gabi Gabi Cubby Cubby land in Australia, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and that sovereignty was never ceded before I talk. And Ben will know that this is a selfish question. We've talked about ecocide a lot, and I wonder if this would be a really, you have environmental stuck in the list with some other issues. I wonder if this would be a way, especially given the traditional ties to the land here with Jukin Gorge that was just erased by the Rio Tinto company, and all of the debate around Uluru and who can be on it, that maybe this would be a way to bring in kind of greater than solastalgia, but not connected to wartime with ecocide. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on where maybe environmental memories in space could be added into this notion as well, if it can.
Yeah, I think that it's intimately ecological, right? In many respects, both because the brain is in a part of an ecology, right? And that's how it learns and how a sense of self develops. And it opens itself up to the idea that the destruction of a space is pretty, and an ecology associated with that is pretty profoundly disruptive. And there's a point where the concept of genos in Lemkin's articulation of it, right, is about what's generated. It's often interpreted as in like bad commentaries on genocide, they'll say, by genos, it's race or tribe, and then you put side, and that means killing, and that's how we get the concept. And that's just wrong etymologically. It's really about what's generated being destroyed. And in a certain way, I think that's also what's at stake in the way people think about ecology in a serious way. And there are any number of crossovers in the history of sort of genocide politics to try to link up the two, the most famous of which, and the earliest of which that I know of, is the 1984 or 85 Whitaker Report, which is the UN special reporter who makes the claim that the Genocide Convention should be reassessed by the members of the United Nations with environmental destruction and place-based destruction as part of its concept. And that does not go over very well. There's a lot of hostility to that notion, but you think about that 35 years later, and it seems like it was really prescient with respect to the way in which both the Anthropocene or the Eurocene are affecting things, but also specific ecologies have been destroyed, and sort of the imbrication of social life and ecology. It's funny, one of the anonymous attendees has asked the question about Flint, Michigan and the poisoning, and that there's a discussion about genocide in that context. And I think that's one of the things that I like about thinking about genocide, is that not thinking about mass violence, but the concept of genocide is it creates felicity to try to articulate and engage new kinds of violence that affect people, again, over long time scales in different kinds of spaces and in different ways. Yeah, that's maybe what I'll say. And in response to that anonymous question, I also think that there's a history of claims about Black genocide in this country that are actually really interesting and have been part of Black nationalist movements following the death of the kind of Civil Rights Congress movement that were prominent. And there's an excellent article by a fellow named Daniel Solomon that's traced out more specifically how that's been leveraged in the US context, but it doesn't surprise me at all. That has also been used in the context of Chicago to talk about police killing or disproportionate killing of Black Americans as a vocabulary to, like, say this is actually an act of genocide because it's known and it's settled and it's volitional. So it's part of that kind of history of racial protest as well.
There's a question here from a student. What do you think of the argument of introducing a legal definition under international law of ethnic cleansing? And maybe it would be helpful to differentiate what ethnic cleansing is from genocide. Would a concept similar to genocide by brain have a space within ethnic cleansing? That's a great question.
So ethnic cleansing is typically understood as an act of displacement, where that displacement crime is simply about getting rid of a group of people in connection to a space, but not destroying the group of people as such. And so what differentiates that classically from genocide is the intent question, yeah? I think that there's certainly room to understand and explore whether or not ethnic cleansing is a tool or a practice of genocide that has these kinds of ramifications, and this argument would lend itself to that. Because one thing that we've known, and I think there's a genocide studies scholar who I sometimes love quite a lot named Helen Fine, who in the 80s and 90s was asking questions in a way that a lot of her contemporaries were not unusual in the academy, who made some claims that displacement often conceals acts of genocide, because you can say as a political elite, I'm displacing a group of people, but then it can have all of these long-term ramifications. And in many ways, I cite her quite significantly in the work that I've written about this, because it in many ways anticipates the argument that there are a series of long-term effects that can come from there that can be genocidal. But I certainly think displacement is an important piece, even if ethnic cleansing sometimes is more, in my mind, a vocabulary that is part of colonial discourse and management and governance of extraterritorial spaces. So I've got some hesitation there as well, I guess.
Any other questions? Again, feel free to just raise your hand or just indicate you want to ask the question, and I'm happy to unmute you. Ben, let me ask a quick question then while we wait. So has there been much contestation about mental harm as a category, using mental harm as a category in any particular attempt to implement international law on genocide? Has any group brought it up, or no?
The most famous politicization associated with it have to do with criminalizing acts of rape in the context of Rwanda and thinking about rape as an act of genocide, which again is not, it is a productive move, right? Because I think that there are gender animated and sexually violent forms of militarist conduct, obviously, and mass violence. But that's the most kind of famous conversation point around it. And it's one that wasn't obviously thought about in the same way in the Genocide Convention, because the problem of gender and gender violence isn't there. But I also think that that's not necessarily the only way one can take mental harm, and that we should want to have more open categories rather than less open categories with respect to this stuff.
Stephanie has another question. Let me see, find her. I'm trying to unmute you, Stephanie, but I can't find you. Do you see her, Ben, on the?
Yes. There you go.
Thank you.
Perfect. I'm an incredibly bad typist. So another question about this is, how is it operationalized? How do you see this? Would it be something that the international could enact and then have it move downward? Or is this something you could see helping people suffering through different sorts of genocide being able to claim in their country first? I'm just really curious about how you see it working.
So that's a great question. I think it could go in both directions, is the truth. This kind of very speculative project that I'm on is part of an article that is under review at Journal of Genocide Research. And the feedback that I got about that was really interesting because some of that was that we should probably be thinking more about how to actually talk to international lawyers around this stuff, because some elements of the conversation are actually quite textualist, right? It's like, this is what the law should be interpreted to mean. And so there may be purchase there to have conversations that are otherwise pretty foreclosed by the way in which genocide law has been predominantly defined. And so maybe there's avenues that could, chip away and create some mobilization there to think a little differently. I think that there's a lot that can be said, though, to try to reframe senses of harm as not just individual traumas, but as ones that can be collectively acknowledged and then talked about differently. And I think that that's maybe the bigger hurdle to some extent than anything when it comes to the problem of genocide, is that like that acknowledgement is tricky. It's funny, you did your land acknowledgement at the beginning. We did here, we could do in Tacoma the concept that this is land that was never ceded in the context of the Puyallup. And how long it took these institutions, for instance, to come to terms with the fact that that minimal form of acknowledgement was necessary, right? Or in the context of Whitman College, the idea that the missionaries was an okay thing to do until just a few years ago is evidence of how hard it is to have some of these conversations. And yet we're not even really talking about genocide per se in any of those. It's very, very limited conversations to some extent. So I think it's part of one broader hurdle. And if it can draw some more people on board with thinking critically about this stuff, then that's my most, I guess, immediate objective.
Fascinating. Thanks, Ben.
There are a couple of questions. One, this goes back to your discussion of gender violence. Considering the mass hysterectomies that occurred in the ICE facilities, how can we address it moving forward in terms of genocide of the brain and gender violence / genocide?
So there are a number of ways in which contemporary American politics has changed, obviously, and complicated the relationship between the execution of policies that are forms of social and political control and the existence of the parts of the Genocide Convention the U.S. has basically assigned on to, right? And I think that the problem here is that when you talk about domestic execution of international legislation, there are a series of reservations and understandings, and the group that would actually bring those charges or claims are the Justice Department. So you would, in this case, have to have the Trump administration bringing a claim against ICE on the basis of a charge about genocide, which is not going to happen. I mean, I guess maybe in the world is chaos and like anything could happen, it could, but it's very unlikely. But I still think it's relevant because people forget that this is a part or a piece of genocide. And so it's an important kind of politicization. I actually had a former classmate messaged me about 2 weeks ago, said, why isn't anyone talking about the problem of hysterectomies in terms of genocide? And I said, well, that's probably because people don't know that hysterectomy could be a form of genocide, that prevention of birth is explicitly outlined as its own part or element of international law. We just don't think about that. As is, by the way, forced transfer of children from one group to another, also part of the Genocide Convention. And usually we think about that in like one state conquers the other, but we obviously have a child transfer policy here in which the child transfer is occurring on the basis of nationality. And if you could prove that there was intention to harm or destroy those people because of the type of group they were, that would also potentially be constitute a form of genocide under the laws that the US has signed onto. Again, that requires the federal government to move forward with those and the way the law is written, which means I think it's really valuable for political protest, but not happening in terms of like policy change anytime soon.
I'm going to ask a question from the chat. How does the term intent impact this analysis in a colonial context of attempting to improve the colony?
So that's a good question. There are not a lot of cases where the question of colonization has been brought up or thought about in the court per se. So one of the things that I think you could do is to show how there is intent to change or modify the way in which the brain and subsequent sociality work that would demonstrate the kinds of harm that are protected under the Genocide Convention. So maybe the most pertinent example of this is the Canadian case that I just talked about towards the end of the talk a few minutes ago, where it's very clear that the state has admitted that there were forms of cultural genocide going on, right? That was part of what the residential school system was adamantly about, was the erasure of First Nations. But that the trick is that cultural genocide is not considered materially significant in the same way that killing might be. And I think where this argument helps fill in is it provides the important link between those cultural forms of violence that are often considered secondary and thinking about those as real material ramifications that the law is actually already provided with. So there's sort of a connection point there. Yeah, Australia as well, certainly, and the US potentially, although we're not at the point where we're having TRC processes yet.
Yeah, Stephanie mentioned, referenced Australia's Apology Day. Another question here, any legal forum you think would be best for adjudicating these claims, how to avoid having these forums reproduce a colonial logic or legacy?
That's a really great question. I think that every time international law goes through a sort of a big movement, there's an aspiration from certain constituencies that it will somehow be more universal than it actually ends up being, right? So the responsibility protects aspiration, it will change things, it doesn't really do that. The ICC aspiration, it ends up prosecuting Africans, right? We could probably look up before that insignificant ways. I'm not sure that the existing international order can really reconcile with the problem of genocide, because if it totally did, then it would call into question most of the basis from which that order is founded, which may be one of the reasons why it really wants to say it stops and engages genocide, but can't really fully do that or take it seriously all the way. So I'm not sure that we've seen totally an answer to that, that kind of predicament yet. I guess I would say one of the most interesting movements to my mind was when Bertrand Russell and Jean-Paul Sartre in the 1960s and 70s organized the trial of the United States for genocide in the context of the war in Vietnam. And they made a full prosecution. They created a little extra legal court system and had arguments made on both sides. And as an experiment, it actually garnered quite a bit of attention at that point in time among certain circles to kind of reframe what was ongoing. And may have been in terms of the leftist movements in the United States and socialist movements in the United States, one of the reasons why they glommed onto the vocabulary of genocide. And I'm sort of at the point where, again, I'm not sure that policy changes are coming or forthcoming anytime soon, but I think that there is something valuable in staging those kind of movements in order to offer up that other interpretation of what's happening as a way of communicating people and changing discourse and changing how people think.
Yeah, it seems to me that every single year, Professor Jackson might agree with this, we have at least one senior who tries to write a thesis to solve exactly that problem of how to make international law or the ways of adjudicating international law decolonial. At least takes an attempt at that question.
But now you don't let them go to 105 pages or whatever, right? They have to be at like 25 or something. Students protest 100-page theses, I promise you. They'll read them.
Because you can figure out the answer to that question in 100 pages, right?
I mean.
Well, we are out of time. We are actually over time. So I wanted to thank Dr. Meiches again for coming here, talking to us, educating us. I always learn something from talking to Ben. So thank you very much. And thank you everybody for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's wonderful to see so many familiar names.